The soldiers at Fort Hamilton thought they knew everything about the quiet woman fixing trucks in their motor pool. They had no idea that the grease-stained mechanic they dismissed and mocked was actually the legendary Ghost Squadron Commander, whose classified missions had saved thousands of lives and prevented international crises. What happened next would shatter every assumption they'd ever made about who deserves respect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samantha Blackwood had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. At 34, she moved through her days like shadow, present but overlooked, skilled but underestimated, carrying herself with the deliberate unremarkability of someone who had learned that visibility could be dangerous. Her small studio apartment above Fletcher's garage in downtown Oakridge reflected this philosophy perfectly. Bare walls, minimal furniture, nothing personal that might invite questions about who she really was or where she'd come from. The garage below had become her sanctuary for the past 3 years. Hank Fletcher, the gruff 70-year-old owner, had hired her without prying into her background, perhaps recognizing a kindred spirit who preferred the honest work of fixing engines to the complications of explaining the past. She spent her days elbow-deep in transmissions, rebuilding carburetors for weekend mechanics, and diagnosing electrical problems that stumped other technicians. Her customers saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a competent but unremarkable woman who could fix their vehicles without unnecessary conversation. What they didn't see were the subtle signs that marked her as something far beyond ordinary. The way her eyes automatically cataloged exit routes in every room she entered. How her hands, steady as surgeon's instruments, could strip and reassemble a complex engine with the same precision she'd once applied to very different equipment. The unconscious military bearing that occasionally surfaced when she thought no one was watching. Shoulders squared, posture perfect, movements economical and purposeful. "Sam, you got magic hands or something?" asked Mrs. Patterson, picking up her restored 1987 Chevy pickup that afternoon. "This old girl purrs like she did when she was new. How'd you learn to work on engines like this?" "YouTube and practice," Sam replied with the easy lies she'd perfected, wiping her hands on a shop rag. The truth, that she had learned vehicle mechanics as part of specialized training that officially didn't exist, wasn't something she could share with a retired school teacher worried about her grocery getter. Mrs. Patterson drove away satisfied, leaving Sam alone in the quiet garage as evening approached. This was her favorite time of day, when the last customer had left and she could work in the peaceful solitude that had become her armor against the world. She was adjusting the timing on a stubborn Ford engine when Officer Daniel Russo pushed through the shop's front door, the bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime that seemed to mock the serious expression on his face. Daniel was one of the few people in Oakridge who'd tried to crack the mystery of Sam Blackwood. As a veteran himself, Army infantry, 2 tours in Afghanistan, he recognized something familiar in her mannerisms, something that whispered of shared experiences in places most civilians couldn't imagine. He'd been trying for months to coax her story from behind the defensive walls she'd built around herself. "Working late again, I see," Daniel said, settling his police uniform against the shop's counter. "When's the last time you did something that didn't involve motor oil and socket wrenches?" "Last Tuesday," Sam replied without looking up from her work. "Fixed a lawnmower." Daniel's laugh held genuine warmth, despite his frustration with her evasiveness. "Look, there's something happening at Fort Hamilton tomorrow. Veterans Appreciation Day. Demonstrations, equipment displays, meet and greets with active duty personnel. Thought you might want to check it out." Sam's hands stilled for just a moment, so briefly that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Daniel caught it, filed it away with all the other tiny reactions that convinced him there was much more to Sam Blackwood than she let anyone see.
"I don't really do military events," she said, resuming her work with practiced nonchalance. Come on, Sam. You can't tell me you're not curious about what the current generation of soldiers is up to. Plus, they've got some impressive equipment on display, stuff that might interest someone with your technical background. The invitation hung in the air between them like an unexploded ordnance. Sam had spent 3 years successfully avoiding anything that might connect her present life to her past service. Military bases were particularly dangerous territory. Too many trained observers, too many people who might recognize something in her bearing or her knowledge that could unravel the carefully constructed civilian identity she'd built. But something in Daniel's persistent concern touched a part of herself she tried to bury, the part that missed being around people who understood what it meant to serve something larger than yourself, the part that had once belonged to an elite community where your skills were valued and your expertise respected. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm better off here," she said finally. Daniel studied her face with the patience of someone trained to read people under stress. "Sam, I've been a cop for 8 years, and before that I was a soldier for 6. I know what it looks like when someone's trying to disappear from their own life. Whatever you're running from, maybe it's time to stop running." After he left, Sam found herself staring at her reflection in the chrome surface of the engine she'd been working on. She looked ordinary, forgettable, exactly what she'd worked to achieve. But Daniel's words lingered like smoke from a distant fire, reminding her of who she used to be before the world decided that someone with her particular skill set was too dangerous to remain visible. That night, she stood in her small bathroom, washing the day's grease from her hands with the methodical thoroughness that had once been drilled into her during training that left no room for shortcuts. As she dried her hands, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of something she kept carefully hidden beneath long sleeves and deliberate positioning. A tattoo. Not the generic military ink that many veterans carried, but something specific, something that told a story most people didn't have the security clearance to hear. The words Ghost Squadron Commander, wrapped around a symbol that existed in no official military manual, surrounded by scars that spoke of training so classified that the casualties were listed as training accidents rather than the cost of creating weapons disguised as human beings. Sam had earned that tattoo through trials that eliminated 90% of candidates before they reached the halfway point. She'd led operations in places that appeared on no public maps, made decisions that prevented international incidents before they could begin, commanded soldiers whose very existence was a state secret. She'd been part of something so elite, so exclusive, that most military personnel had never even heard rumors of their missions. Then politics had intervened, and heroes had become liabilities overnight. The same skills that had made her invaluable in the field became reasons she was too dangerous to keep visible. One classified operation that succeeded beyond all expectations had somehow become the reason she needed to disappear. Now she fixed trucks for people who saw her nothing more than a competent mechanic. The irony wasn't lost on her. Someone who had once been trusted with national security secrets was now considered qualified only to change oil and replace brake pads. But as she looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe 3 years of hiding was enough. The next morning would bring a choice that would shatter the careful invisibility she'd constructed around herself. She had no way of knowing that by evening, her deliberately ordinary life would be in ruins, and the Ghost Squadron Commander would be forced back into the light. Some secrets, she was about to learn, were too big to stay buried forever. The next morning arrived with the predictable rhythm that had defined Sam's life for 3 years. She was under the hood of a 2015 Honda Civic by 7 a.m., diagnosing a mysterious rattling sound that had stumped 2 other mechanics. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, testing components and listening to the engine's subtle language with an ear trained by years of working with far more complex machinery than most people would ever encounter. "Morning, Sam," Hank Fletcher called out as he unlocked the office, his weathered face already showing the day's first smile. At 70, Hank had seen enough of life to appreciate employees who showed up early, worked hard, and didn't create drama. Sam Blackwood was the best hire he'd made in 40 years of running Fletcher's garage. "Morning, Hank. Mrs. Chen's Honda has a loose heat shield on the exhaust manifold. 15-minute fix," Sam replied without emerging from under the hood. Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who understood mechanical systems the way most people understood breathing. Hank nodded approvingly. That woman spent 3 different shops with that rattling. How'd you figure it out so fast? Sam finally stood up, wiping her hands on a shop rag with movements that were economical, purposeful. Process of elimination. Most mechanics look for complicated problems first. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. It was a philosophy that had served her well in both her current life and her previous career, though Hank had no way of knowing that the woman fixing his customers' cars had once applied similar logical thinking to situations where the wrong conclusion could mean international incidents or the deaths of entire teams. The morning progressed with its usual steady flow of customers. Sam rotated tires for Mr. Davidson's pickup truck, replaced brake pads on the Wilson family's minivan, and performed an oil change on a police cruiser that belonged to Daniel's department. Each task was completed with the same methodical precision, the same quiet competence that had made her invisible in plain sight. "You know," said Officer Martinez, picking up his patrol car after the oil change, "Russo keeps talking about you, said you should come out to some of the veteran events around town. You served, right?" Sam's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes, a momentary tension that appeared and disappeared so quickly that most people would have missed it entirely. After he left, Sam found herself thinking about the casual assumptions people made about military service. They saw it as a single, shared experience, as if everyone who'd worn a uniform had walked the same path, faced the same challenges, belonged to the same community. They had no idea that some paths diverged so far from the standard military experience that the travelers became entirely different creatures, operating in shadows that most service members never even knew existed. Around lunchtime, Daniel appeared again, this time carrying 2 sandwiches from the deli down the street. It had become a weekly ritual, his transparent attempt to build a friendship with someone who seemed determined to avoid meaningful human connections. "Turkey and Swiss, light on the mayo," he said, setting one wrapped sandwich on her workbench. "Figured you probably forgot to eat again." Sam accepted the sandwich with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't have to keep feeding me, Daniel." "Someone has to." "When's the last time you ate anything that didn't come from a vending machine?" They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Sam perched on a stool next to her current project, a transmission rebuild that would have intimidated most professional mechanics. Daniel watched her work between bites, noting the way her hands moved with surgical precision, the unconscious way she organized her tools with military efficiency. "You know," he said finally, "I keep thinking about that invitation to Fort Hamilton. Veterans Appreciation Day isn't just about current military, it's about honoring everyone who served. You might find it interesting to see how things have changed." Sam's hands paused in their work, just for a second. Some things are better left in the past. Maybe. Or maybe the past has things to teach the present. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the gentle persistence of someone who recognized pain and wanted to help heal it. "Look, I don't know what happened during your service. I don't know what you're running from or what you're trying to forget. But I know isolation when I see it, and I know it's not healthy."
I'm not isolated. I work with people every day. You work for people. That's different, and you know it. Daniel's expression grew serious. Sam, whatever unit you served with, whatever you did, it shaped you into someone with incredible skills and discipline. But it also left you afraid to let anyone get close enough to see who you really are. The accuracy of his observation hit like a physical blow. Sam had spent 3 years perfecting the art of functional relationships, interactions that served a purpose without creating vulnerability. She could be friendly without being friends, helpful without being close, competent without being known. The appreciation event tomorrow, Daniel continued, it's not about reliving the past. It's about connecting with people who understand what service means. Maybe it's time you stopped hiding from that part of yourself. Sam looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just a persistent cop trying to play amateur therapist, but a fellow veteran who'd somehow managed to transition back into civilian life without losing touch with the community that had forged him. The difference between them was stark. Daniel wore his military service like a comfortable old jacket, something that had shaped him but didn't define his limitations. Sam wore hers like a hair shirt, a constant reminder of capabilities she could never use and a past she could never fully escape. "What makes you think I'm hiding from anything?" she asked quietly. Daniel's smile held no judgment, only understanding. "Because I spent 2 years hiding from my own service after I got back. Thought if I just kept my head down and pretended it never happened, the nightmares would stop and I could be normal again. Took me a long time to realize that the experiences that changed us don't just disappear because we want them to." That afternoon, after Daniel left, Sam found herself thinking about his words as she worked on the transmission. Her movements were automatic, muscle memory guiding her hands through procedures she could perform blindfolded. But her mind was elsewhere, drifting back to memories she'd spent 3 years trying to suppress. She remembered the weight of command, the responsibility of making decisions that affected not just her own team, but the success of operations that could shift the balance of international relations. She remembered the trust of soldiers who followed her into situations that defied conventional military doctrine because they believed in her judgment, her training, her ability to bring them home alive. Most of all, she remembered the moment when it all ended. Not with honor or recognition, but with political maneuvering that turned heroes into liabilities and decorated veterans into security risks who needed to disappear. As closing time approached, Sam found herself standing in the garage doorway, looking out at the quiet street of downtown Oakridge. This had been her world for 3 years. Safe, predictable, manageable. But Daniel's words had awakened something she'd tried to bury, a recognition that hiding from her past wasn't the same as healing from it. The phone in her pocket buzzed with a text message. "Daniel, the invitation's still open. Sometimes the best way to move forward is to remember what you're moving forward from." Sam stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over the keyboard. 3 years of carefully constructed isolation had kept her safe, but hadn't made her whole. Maybe it was time to test whether the Ghost Squadron Commander could exist in the same world as Sam the mechanic, or whether some identities were too different to coexist. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether the carefully ordinary life she'd built was worth more than the chance to remember who she used to be. The decision came at 6:30 the next morning, not through careful deliberation, but through the simple act of Daniel Russo showing up at her apartment door with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of determined expression that brooked no argument. "You're coming with me today," he announced, handing her one of the steaming cups. "No more excuses, no more deflecting. It's time." Sam stood in her doorway wearing yesterday's work clothes, her hair pulled back in the same practical ponytail she'd worn for 3 years, looking every inch the reluctant civilian Daniel was trying to coax out of hiding. But something in his tone, a quiet authority that reminded her of officers who'd once trusted her with impossible missions, made her pause instead of closing the door in his face. "Daniel, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but nothing," he interrupted gently. "Sam, I've watched you for 3 years. You're the most competent person I know, but you're wasting away in that garage like a thoroughbred racehorse pulling a plow. Whatever happened in your past, hiding from it isn't making it go away." She studied his face, seeing not just the persistent cop who'd been trying to break through her defenses, but the fellow veteran who recognized something broken in her that mirrored his own struggles. The coffee in her hands was perfectly prepared. Black with just a hint of sugar, exactly how she learned to drink it during long nights in forward operating bases where comfort was measured in small gestures. "You don't understand what you're asking," she said quietly. "Then explain it to me." Daniel's voice carried the patient tone of someone who'd learned that the most important conversations happened slowly, carefully, with space for the truth to emerge without pressure. "Help me understand why someone with your skills and training is afraid to be around other military personnel." The question hung between them like a challenge. Sam had spent 3 years perfecting responses that deflected inquiry without providing information. But something in Daniel's direct approach made her usual evasions feel inadequate. He deserved better than deflection. He deserved honesty, even if she couldn't give him the whole truth. Some military experiences don't translate well to civilian life. Some training leaves you changed in ways that make normal interactions complicated. Daniel nodded slowly, as if this explanation filled in pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve since they'd first met. Special operations? The accuracy of his guess sent a chill through her. Sam had been careful never to display skills or knowledge that would hint at specialized training, but apparently she hadn't been as successful at hiding her true background as she had believed. "What makes you say that?" she asked, neither confirming nor denying his assumption. "Little things. The way you move, always aware of exits, always positioned where you can see threats coming. The precision in everything you do, like someone trained to perform under extreme pressure. And mostly the way you avoid situations where someone might recognize those skills." Daniel stepped closer, his expression shifting from friendly persistence to professional concern. "Sam, I've worked with enough veterans to recognize the signs. You're not just dealing with normal adjustment issues, you're hiding from something specific, something that makes you afraid to be around other military personnel." She wanted to tell him he was wrong, to maintain the comfortable fiction that she was just a mechanic who preferred solitude. But the coffee in her hands was growing cold, and the earnest concern in his eyes was breaking down defenses she'd spent years building. "The Fort Hamilton event, it's not just social for you, is it? You think I need to be around military people for some kind of therapeutic reason?" "I think," Daniel said carefully, "that you've been in exile long enough. Whatever happened, whatever went wrong, you've paid whatever price was required. It's time to stop punishing yourself." The word exile hit with unexpected precision. That's exactly what the last 3 years had been. Not retirement or transition, but banishment from a world where her skills and experience had meaning. She'd been cast out from the only community that understood what she had sacrificed and achieved, forced to pretend that the most important years of her life had never happened. "You have no idea what you're asking me to risk," she said. "Then tell me. Help me understand why going to a Veterans Appreciation event feels like a threat instead of an opportunity."
Sam looked past him at the quiet street where her neighbors were beginning their normal Saturday routines, walking dogs, retrieving newspapers, heading out for weekend errands. All the mundane activities of people whose biggest concerns were mortgage payments and lawn care. People who'd never had to make decisions where the wrong choice could destabilize entire regions or cost hundreds of lives. "What if," she said slowly, "your military service had been so classified that officially it never happened? What if the skills you'd learned and the missions you'd completed were so sensitive that acknowledging them publicly could create international incidents? What if the price of keeping those secrets was pretending you'd never been anything more than ordinary?" Daniel's expression grew serious as he began to understand the scope of what she was suggesting. Black operations? She didn't answer directly, but the slight tightening around her eyes was confirmation enough. "Jesus, Sam, how long have you been carrying this alone?" 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, she replied without thinking, then caught herself. The precision of her count revealed more than she'd intended about how carefully she'd been marking time in exile. Daniel set his coffee cup on the porch railing and faced her directly. "Listen to me. I don't know what unit you served with or what you did or why you had to disappear. But I know that isolation isn't healing you. It's just postponing the problem. You can't spend the rest of your life hiding from who you used to be. Some identities are too dangerous to resurrect. Maybe. Or maybe you've convinced yourself they're dangerous because being ordinary feels safer than risking recognition." Daniel's voice took on the gentle authority of someone who'd learned to counsel veterans through difficult transitions. "Sam, what's the worst that could happen if you spent one afternoon around active-duty military personnel?" The question forced her to examine fears she'd never articulated. Recognition, certainly. The possibility that someone might see through her civilian disguise to the operator beneath. Questions about her service record, her discharge, her current status. The unraveling of 3 years of careful invisibility. But underneath those practical concerns was something deeper. The fear that she might remember too much, feel too much. want things she could never have again. The fear that one taste of the community she'd lost would make her current exile unbearable. "I'll make you a deal," Daniel said, sensing her internal struggle. "Come with me for 2 hours. If you're uncomfortable, if anything happens that makes you want to leave, I'll bring you home immediately. No questions, no pressure for explanations." Sam looked at him for a long moment, seeing not just the persistent friend who refused to let her hide, but the fellow veteran who understood that some wounds couldn't heal in isolation. The coffee in her hands had grown cold, but the warmth of human connection, something she'd denied herself for 3 years, was beginning to thaw defenses she'd thought were permanent. 2 hours, she said finally, and if this goes badly, I never want to hear about military events again. Daniel's smile was worth the risk. "Deal. But Sam, I don't think this is going to go badly. I think it's going to remind you of something you've forgotten." "What's that?" "That you're not just a mechanic who used to be a soldier, you're a soldier who's been pretending to be just a mechanic. There's a difference." As she went inside to change into clean clothes, she caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. For 3 years, she'd seen only the civilian disguise, the ordinary woman who fixed cars and avoided complications. But Daniel's words had awakened something else, a recognition that the Ghost Squadron Commander had never really disappeared. She'd just been waiting for permission to remember who she used to be. Today, that permission would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine.
The drive to Fort Hamilton took 43 minutes, but for Sam it felt like a journey back through time. As Daniel's pickup truck approached the base entrance, she found herself automatically cataloging security measures with the practiced eye of someone who'd once been responsible for assessing threats and vulnerabilities. Guard positions, vehicle barriers, sight lines, details that most visitors would never notice, but that had once been second nature to evaluate. "You okay?" Daniel asked, noticing her increased tension as they joined the line of civilian vehicles waiting for security clearance. "Fine," Sam replied, but her hands were clenched in her lap, and she'd unconsciously straightened into a more military bearing despite her civilian clothes. Dark jeans, a simple gray sweater, and boots that could pass for casual but were actually tactical footwear she'd never been able to give up. Her base itself was impressive in the way that all modern military installations were designed to be. Clean lines, purposeful architecture, everything maintained to standards that spoke of discipline and pride. American flags flew at precisely regulated heights, and the landscaping was geometric in its perfection. For most visitors, it would seem like a monument to military efficiency. For Sam, it felt like coming home to a place that had disowned her. "First time back on a base since your discharge?" Daniel asked quietly as they parked in the designated civilian area. Sam nodded, not trusting her voice. The last military installation she had seen had been the secure facility where she'd been debriefed, processed out, and essentially erased from official records. That had been a sterile, bureaucratic experience designed to sever all connections to her former life. This was different, alive with the energy of active duty personnel going about their daily missions. The Veterans Appreciation Day event was held on the main parade ground with displays of military equipment, demonstration areas, and information booths staffed by enthusiastic young soldiers eager to share their pride in service. Families wandered between exhibits, children climbed on decommissioned vehicles, and veterans of all ages reconnected with active duty personnel who represented the continuation of their legacy. "Impressive setup," Sam observed, her professional eye automatically assessing the organization and security of the event. Everything was precisely planned, from crowd control to emergency protocols, the kind of attention to detail that had once been her responsibility to notice and approve. They moved through the displays slowly, Daniel maintaining casual conversation while Sam absorbed the sights and sounds of military life she'd been exiled from. The young soldiers staffing the exhibits carried themselves with the confident energy of people who believed in their mission, who woke up each morning knowing their work served something larger than personal ambition. At the communications equipment display, an eager young specialist was explaining encrypted radio systems to a group of curious civilians. Sam listened for a few minutes, noting technical details that the specialist was simplifying for his audience.
recognizing equipment that had evolved from systems she'd once used in situations where communication failures meant mission compromise and lives lost. Pretty advanced stuff, the specialist said, noticing Sam's intense attention to his explanation. We can maintain secure communications across vast distances, coordinate complex operations with multiple units, ensure that everyone stays connected even in hostile environments. What's the range limitation on the ANPRC 158? Sam asked without thinking, then caught herself as the specialist's expression shifted from routine explanation to surprised attention. Ma'am, that's a pretty specific question. Are you familiar with military communications equipment? Sam felt Daniel's curious glance, but kept her expression neutral. I've seen similar systems before. Just wondered about the technical specifications. The specialist's answer was technically correct but incomplete. He was sharing information appropriate for public demonstration while carefully avoiding details that might compromise operational security. Sam recognized the careful balance between education and protection, the same considerations she had once had to navigate when briefing personnel who had different clearance levels. As they moved away from the communications display, Daniel's expression carried new questions. That was a pretty informed question for someone who supposedly just fixes cars. I read military technical manuals sometimes. Helps me understand vehicle systems that have military applications. It was a reasonable explanation, but Daniel's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. He'd spent enough time around military personnel to recognize someone's knowledge went beyond casual reading.
They approached the physical training demonstration area, where a group of young soldiers were showcasing combat fitness techniques for impressed civilian observers. Push-ups, pull-ups, obstacle course runs, all performed with the kind of enthusiastic precision that characterized military personnel trying to impress their community supporters. "Check out the civilians watching," one soldier muttered to his buddy, voice carrying just enough to reach Sam's ears. "Probably never done a real push-up in their lives. Think they could handle 10 minutes of basic training?" Sam bit back a response that would have revealed far more than she was comfortable sharing. She'd completed training regimens that made basic military fitness standards look like warm-up exercises, had maintained operational readiness in conditions that would hospitalize most people. But she was supposed to be just another impressed civilian, admiring capabilities she could never hope to match. "Ma'am," called Sergeant First Class Derek Palmer, one of the soldiers managing the demonstration, "would you like to try the modified obstacle course? We've got a civilian-friendly version that's pretty fun." The invitation was offered with the kind of patronizing enthusiasm that suggested he expected her to politely decline or attempt a few elements before giving up with good-natured embarrassment. Sam felt Daniel's attention sharpen. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd probably hoped for, a chance for her to engage with military personnel in a low-stakes environment. "I'll pass, but thank you," Sam replied politely, knowing that any display of her actual physical capabilities would raise questions she couldn't answer without compromising her carefully maintained cover. "Come on," Palmer encouraged with the persistent friendliness of someone who'd been trained to engage community members. "It's all about participation, not performance. We love seeing civilians challenge themselves." Around them, other visitors were taking up the challenge, attempting modified versions of military exercises, while soldiers offered encouragement and assistance. Children were cheering for their parents, spouses were taking photos, and the entire scene radiated the kind of wholesome community engagement that public relations officers dreamed about. "Really, I'm fine just watching," Sam insisted, but she could see that her continued refusal was starting to draw more attention than participation would have. "Tell you what," Palmer said with a grin, "if you're worried about embarrassing yourself, I'll run the course with you. Make it a team effort." The suggestion was meant to be supportive, but Sam recognized the underlying assumption that she needed assistance and encouragement to attempt physical challenges that were routine for military personnel. 3 years ago, she would have been the one designing training courses that pushed elite operators to their absolute limits. "Sam," Daniel said quietly, "it might be fun. No pressure, but maybe it would be good for you to challenge yourself a little." She looked around at the expectant faces, the encouraging smiles, the assumption that she was just another civilian visitor who might benefit from a gentle introduction to military fitness standards.
For 3 years, she'd accepted this kind of benevolent condescension, had learned to smile and deflect rather than demonstrate capabilities that would raise uncomfortable questions. But something about being back in a military environment, surrounded by the energy and purpose she had lost, made the pretense feel heavier than usual. She was tired of being underestimated, tired of hiding abilities that had once been a source of pride and purpose. "You know what?" she said finally, surprising herself with the decision. "Why not?" Palmer's face lit up with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully encouraged a reluctant participant. "Excellent. Don't worry, we'll take it nice and easy." As Sam stepped toward the modified obstacle course, she had no idea that Major Isabella Cross was watching from the observation area, her trained eye noting something in the way the civilian woman moved that didn't match her humble demeanor, something that looked surprisingly familiar, though she couldn't yet place where she might have seen it before.
The modified civilian obstacle course had been designed to provide a fun challenge without risking injury to untrained participants. Wooden barriers low enough for easy climbing, rope crawls that didn't require upper body strength, and balance beams wide enough to accommodate normal coordination levels. It was the military equivalent of a children's playground, safe, encouraging, and completely non-threatening. "All right, ma'am," Sergeant Palmer said with patronizing enthusiasm. "We'll start you off nice and slow. Remember, this isn't about speed or performance, it's just about having fun and trying something new." Sam nodded politely, but internally she was calculating distances, analyzing optimal movement patterns, and automatically planning the most efficient route through obstacles that would have presented zero challenge during her actual military training. The course that these soldiers considered appropriate for civilians was less demanding than the warm-up exercises she'd once performed before beginning real training sessions. A small crowd had gathered to watch the demonstrations, including family members taking photos and other veterans who'd been drawn by the activity. Among them were several active duty personnel from the 12th Mechanized Infantry, young soldiers who carried themselves with the confident arrogance of people who'd completed basic training and believed they understood what military excellence looked like. "Check out this soccer mom trying to play soldier," Private Lucas Bennett muttered to his buddy, Corporal Jessica Wong, both of them watching Sam with amusement. $20 says she doesn't make it past the rope crawl." "You're on," Wong replied with a smirk. "I give her credit for trying, but this is going to be painful to watch. These civilian courses are basically designed for people who think walking upstairs counts as cardio." The comments weren't directed at Sam specifically, but in the way that military personnel had learned to communicate, voices pitched just low enough to seem private while remaining audible to anyone paying attention. Sam had heard variations of this mockery throughout her career, from instructors who believed women had no place in special operations to enemy combatants who'd underestimated her until it was too late. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Ma'am, whenever you're ready," Sergeant Palmer called out, positioning himself near the first obstacle with the patient demeanor of someone prepared to offer assistance and encouragement throughout what he assumed would be a struggling performance. Sam approached the starting line, automatically adjusting her stance in ways that would optimize her performance while still appearing amateur enough to maintain her civilian disguise. It was a delicate balance. She needed to avoid embarrassing herself completely while not displaying capabilities that would raise questions about her background. The first obstacle was a low wooden wall, barely 4 feet high, designed to give participants a sense of accomplishment for completing a basic climbing challenge. Sam approached it with deliberate hesitation, placing her hands carefully and pulling herself over with movements that appeared awkward but were actually precisely controlled to look untrained. "Good job," Palmer called out enthusiastically. "See? Nothing to it. Take your time on the next one." The encouragement was genuine but carried the undertone of surprise that often accompanied interactions between military personnel and civilians who exceeded their minimal expectations. Behind her, she could hear continued commentary from the watching soldiers. "Actually doing better than I expected," Bennett admitted grudgingly. "Still looks like she's never seen a real obstacle course, but at least she's not embarrassing herself completely." "Wait until she hits the rope crawl," Wong predicted. "That's where the civilians always fall apart. Upper body strength isn't something you can fake."
Sam moved through the next several obstacles with the same calculated mediocrity, competent enough to avoid humiliation, awkward enough to maintain her cover. The balance beam, the low hurdles, the tire run, each one completed with performance that suggested someone trying hard but lacking proper training or natural athletic ability. Major Isabella Cross continued watching from the observation area, her expression growing more thoughtful with each obstacle Sam completed. Something about the woman's movement patterns was triggering recognition, a familiarity that Cross couldn't quite place, but that was becoming more insistent with each demonstration of controlled capability disguised as amateur effort.
She's holding back, Cross murmured to herself, too quietly for anyone else to hear. There was something in the precise way the civilian woman was managing her performance, a level of body control that suggested far more training than her awkward execution would indicate. The rope crawl was designed to be the course's most challenging element, a 30-foot section where participants had to pull themselves along a rope suspended 2 feet off the ground, using primarily upper body strength and core stability. For most civilians, it represented a legitimate test of fitness that often resulted in exhausted halfway completions and good-natured surrender. "This is where it gets interesting," Palmer announced to the watching crowd. "The rope crawl requires some real strength and determination. Don't worry if you need to take breaks. Most people can't complete it on their first try." Sam studied the obstacle, automatically calculating hand placements, body positioning, and the most efficient technique for completion. In her previous life, rope crawls had been basic elements in training regimens that pushed elite operators to their absolute limits. She'd completed versions that were longer, higher, and incorporated under fire, literally. "Take your time," Palmer encouraged. "Remember, it's about effort, not results." The gathered soldiers were paying closer attention now, anticipating the entertainment that usually came when overconfident civilians encountered obstacles that required genuine physical capability. Their expressions carried the familiar mix of curiosity and condescension that Sam had learned to expect from military personnel who assumed that anyone outside their community was fundamentally less capable. "This should be good," Bennett commented, pulling out his phone to record what he expected would be an amusing struggle. Nothing like watching reality hit civilian fitness fantasies. "Be nice," Wong replied, but her tone suggested she was equally interested in seeing how the soccer mom would handle a real physical challenge. Sam approached the rope with apparent hesitation, testing its tension and examining the setup with the careful attention of someone who wanted to avoid injury through inexperience. But her assessment was far more sophisticated than it appeared. She was noting the rope's construction, the anchor points, the optimal grip positions, and calculating the precise technique that would allow efficient completion while still appearing untrained. "You've got this," Daniel called out supportively from the crowd, his voice carrying genuine encouragement mixed with curiosity about how his mechanically gifted friend would handle a physical challenge that had nothing to do with fixing engines. The moment had arrived when Sam would have to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed civilian facade and demonstrating capabilities that might raise uncomfortable questions. She gripped the rope, positioned her body, and made a decision that would change everything about how the watching soldiers perceived the quiet woman they'd been underestimating. What happened next would shatter every assumption they'd made about who deserves respect and what real capability looks like when it chooses to remain hidden. Sam gripped the rope and made her choice. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of accepting condescension and underestimation, 3 years of pretending to be less than she was. It all crystallized in that moment of decision. She was tired of being invisible for the wrong reasons. Her movement across the rope was poetry in motion, not the clumsy, exhausting struggle that everyone expected from an untrained civilian, but the fluid, efficient technique of someone who'd mastered advanced combat training. Her body moved with mechanical precision, hand over hand, core engaged, legs providing perfect stability and momentum. She covered the 30-foot distance in seconds that seemed to stretch like hours for the watching crowd.
The silence that followed her completion was profound. Even the ambient sounds of the broader event seemed muted as dozens of military personnel tried to process what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't beginner's luck or adrenaline-fueled determination. This was the kind of textbook-perfect execution that required thousands of hours of training and the muscle memory that came from performing under pressure. "What the hell was that?" Bennett breathed, his phone still recording but forgotten in his hand. Sergeant Palmer's encouraging smile had frozen on his face. In 15 years of military service, he'd seen enough rope crawl attempts to recognize the difference between civilian effort and professional capability. What Sam had just demonstrated wasn't something you learned at weekend fitness classes or by watching YouTube videos. "Ma'am," Palmer said carefully, his tone shifting from patronizing encouragement to something approaching professional respect. "That was exceptionally well executed. Have you done obstacle course training before?" Sam's mind raced through possible explanations that might account for her performance without revealing her true background. CrossFit training, rock climbing experience, general fitness enthusiasm, all plausible but inadequate to explain the specific technique she'd just displayed. "I stay in shape," she replied with studied casualness, but even she could hear how inadequate the explanation sounded. Major Isabella Cross had moved closer during Sam's performance, her expression shifting from casual observation to intense professional interest. The movement patterns she'd witnessed weren't just athletic, they were specifically military, and not just any military training. The precision, the efficiency, the unconscious way the woman had adjusted her technique for optimal performance, it all pointed to specialized instruction that most service members never received. "That was incredible," called out a civilian observer, breaking the strange tension that had settled over the military personnel. "You made it look so easy." Other non-military spectators joined in with congratulations and requests for fitness tips. But Sam could feel the weight of professional scrutiny from the soldiers who understood the difference between impressive and impossible. She'd crossed a line, revealed capabilities that raised questions she couldn't answer without compromising everything she'd worked to hide. "Would you like to try the advanced course?" Palmer asked, his question carrying new implications. The advanced course wasn't offered to civilian participants. It was designed for military personnel and required waivers that acknowledged the risk of serious injury. "I think I've done enough for one day," Sam deflected, but her refusal only added to the growing sense that something didn't add up about the quiet woman who just demonstrated elite-level physical capabilities. Daniel approached her with an expression that mixed pride and confusion. "Sam, that was amazing. Where did you learn to move like that?" Before she could answer, Corporal Wong stepped forward with the kind of direct challenge that young soldiers used when they encountered something that didn't fit their understanding of the world. "Ma'am, no offense, but that wasn't normal civilian fitness. That was military-grade technique. What's your background?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Sam felt the familiar tightness in her chest when her carefully constructed identity was under threat. Around her, more military personnel had stopped their other activities and were paying attention to the conversation, drawn by the sense that something significant was happening. "I told you I stay in shape," Sam repeated, but her voice carried less conviction than before.
"That's not an answer," Wong pressed, her tone respectful but persistent. "I've been through advanced combat training, and what you just did requires specific instruction. You don't develop that kind of rope technique from civilian fitness programs." Sam could see Major Cross approaching from the observation area, her stride carrying the purposeful authority of someone who'd made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire encounter. The Major's expression was thoughtful, analytical, the look of someone fitting together pieces of a puzzle that was starting to form a recognizable picture. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more private," Cross suggested, her voice carrying the quiet command authority that comes with rank and experience.
It wasn't really a suggestion. I appreciate the offer, but I should really be going, Sam replied, already calculating exit routes and extraction strategies with the automatic planning that had once kept her alive in hostile environments. I don't think that would be wise, Cross said, gently but firmly. Ms. Blackwood, Sam Blackwood. Cross nodded slowly, as if the name meant something to her, though Sam was certain they'd never met. Ms. Blackwood, I think there are some things we need to discuss, things that might be better addressed away from curious crowds. The gathering of soldiers and civilians had grown larger, drawn by the sense that something unusual was happening. Sam could feel the weight of attention, the speculation, the growing certainty that her 3 years of carefully maintained anonymity were about to end in the most public way possible. Look, Bennett said, still processing what he'd witnessed. That was some serious operator-level stuff. Nobody moves like that without serious training. What unit were you with? Wong added, her earlier mockery replaced by professional curiosity. That technique looked familiar, but I can't place it. Sam realized that she was at a crossroads that she'd been approaching for 3 years without acknowledging it. She could continue deflecting, make excuses, and leave the base with her cover intact, but her relationship with Daniel probably destroyed by the questions she couldn't answer. Or she could trust that the community she'd been forced to leave might be ready to welcome her back, even if it meant exposing secrets she'd been ordered to keep hidden. The decision was made for her when she caught sight of her reflection in the window of a nearby building. For just a moment, the afternoon sun illuminated her in a way that highlighted not the mechanic she'd pretended to be, but the warrior she'd never stopped being. Her posture, her bearing, the unconscious way she'd positioned herself to maintain situational awareness, all of it spoke to training that went beyond anything these soldiers had experienced. "You want to know about my background?" Sam said quietly, her voice carrying new authority as she made the choice that would end her exile. "Maybe it's time you learned about units that don't appear in official organizational charts." Major Cross's eyes sharpened with recognition and something that might have been vindication. She'd suspected there was more to this woman than appeared on the surface, and now she was about to discover just how much more. The revelation that would change everything was about to begin, starting with 3 words that would transform how everyone present understood the quiet woman they'd underestimated: Ghost Squadron Commander.
The words hung in the air like a live grenade. Ghost Squadron wasn't a unit name that appeared in standard military references or organizational charts. It existed in whispered conversations between intelligence officers, in classified briefings that required clearances most personnel would never achieve, in after-action reports that were sealed before the ink dried. Major Cross's expression shifted from professional curiosity to something approaching awe. Ghost Squadron, she repeated quietly, as if testing the words to make sure she'd heard correctly. That's not possible. Why not? Sam asked, her voice carrying new authority as she abandoned the civilian persona she'd maintained for 3 years. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Her posture straightened, her tone gained command presence, and suddenly, the woman who'd been apologetically navigating a simple obstacle course looked like someone who'd earned the right to question a major's assumptions. Cross studied Sam's face with the intensity of someone trying to reconcile legend with reality. Because Ghost Squadron is classified above my clearance level. Because the people who served in that unit are either dead or have disappeared so completely that the intelligence community considers them ghosts in more than name. The gathered soldiers exchanged confused glances. Bennett and Wong had never heard of Ghost Squadron, but Major Cross's reaction made it clear they were discussing something far beyond their experience or security clearance. The casual military banter had evolved into something that felt dangerous, important, and completely outside their understanding. Maybe, Sam said carefully, some ghosts are better at hiding than others.
Daniel stepped forward, his expression carrying the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about his friend was about to be rewritten. Sam, what exactly are you telling us? Before she could answer, the afternoon breeze shifted her sleeves slightly, revealing just a hint of ink on her left wrist. It was barely visible, a few lines that most people would dismiss as a random design or decorative tattoo. But Major Cross caught sight of it, and her professional training in intelligence analysis made connections that civilian observers would miss. "May I see your wrist?" Cross asked, her voice carrying the careful authority of someone who suspected they were about to confirm something extraordinary. Sam hesitated for a moment that felt like hours. 3 years of hiding, 3 years of keeping secrets that had been classified at levels that made national security look like public information. But she'd already crossed the line by mentioning Ghost Squadron. There was no path back to anonymity now. She rolled up her left sleeve, revealing the tattoo that had been hidden beneath civilian clothing for over 1,000 days. The ink was faded but still clearly recognizable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Ghost Squadron Commander wrapped around a symbol that didn't exist in any official military documentation, surrounded by scars that told their own story of training so intense that injury was considered part of the curriculum. The silence that followed was profound. Major Cross stared at the tattoo with the expression of someone who just encountered something that shouldn't exist. Ghost Squadron personnel weren't supposed to have identifying marks. Their very existence depended on being able to disappear completely into civilian populations. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, then caught herself and straightened into full military bearing. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions that require privacy and security protocols I can't maintain in this environment." Bennett was recording everything with his phone, his earlier amusement replaced with the recognition that he was witnessing something historically significant. "What does it mean? Ghost Squadron Commander? Is that like Special Forces?" Cross turned to him with sharp authority. "Private Bennett, delete that recording immediately and forget everything you just heard. That's not a request." "But Major, that's an order, soldier. What you're witnessing is classified beyond your clearance level, and discussing it further could result in charges that would end your military career permanently." Sam watched the exchange with familiar resignation. This was how it always went when her true background was revealed. The immediate classification protocols, the need-to-know restrictions, and the transformation of normal military conversation into something that required security clearances and official channels. "It's too late for that," she said quietly. "The secret's out. Has been since I mentioned the unit name." She nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to move this conversation to a secure location immediately. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me voluntarily, or I'll have to make it official."
"What's Ghost Squadron?" Wong pressed, her curiosity overriding the Major's warnings about classification levels. "I've never heard of any unit by that name." "Because," Sam said, looking directly at the young corporal, "Ghost Squadron handled operations that were so classified they officially never happened. We were the unit that prevented international incidents before they could begin, extracted hostages from situations that intelligence deemed impossible, eliminated threats that could never be acknowledged publicly." The revelation sent ripples through the gathered crowd. Civilian observers were beginning to sense that something serious was happening, while military personnel struggled to process the implications of what they were hearing. "The Kazan crisis," Cross said suddenly, her voice carrying new understanding. "The hostage extraction that prevented a nuclear incident between India and Pakistan? Intelligence reports said it was Ghost Squadron, but we were told those reports were disinformation." Sam's slight smile held no humor. "Officially, that operation never happened. Officially, Ghost Squadron never existed. Officially, I've been a civilian mechanic for the past 3 years with no military background worth mentioning." "But unofficially?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone who finally understood why his friend had been hiding from her own service record. "Unofficially," Sam replied, "I commanded the most elite unit in the American military. We completed missions that saved thousands of lives and prevented conflicts that could have destabilized entire regions. And when politics decided that units like ours were too dangerous to acknowledge, we were disbanded and ordered to disappear." Major Cross was already reaching for her secure communication device. "Ma'am, I need to contact my superiors immediately. If you are who you claim to be, there are protocols that need to be followed, clearances that need to be verified, and people who are going to want to speak with you very urgently." "I know," Sam said, with the resigned acceptance of someone who'd known this day would eventually come. "I've been expecting this conversation for 3 years. I just hoped it would happen on my terms instead of in front of a crowd at a public event." The tattoo on her wrist seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, evidence of service so classified that acknowledging it created security implications that would ripple through multiple government agencies. The quiet mechanic who'd been dismissed as a curious civilian was about to become the center of attention that would extend far beyond Fort Hamilton. The Ghost Squadron Commander had stepped back into the light, and nothing would ever be the same.
Word spread through Fort Hamilton with a velocity that only military gossip could achieve. Within an hour of the tattoo revelation, every officer, NCO, and enlisted soldier on the base had heard some version of the story. The details varied with each telling. Some said she'd been undercover, others claimed she'd been testing base security, but the core truth remained constant. The Ghost Squadron Commander was real, she was here, and she'd been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. The secure briefing room, where Major Cross had escorted Sam, felt like a time machine, transporting her back to similar rooms where she'd planned operations that existed only in classified files. Gray walls, no windows, whiteboards that had been wiped clean but still held faint traces of previous strategic discussions. The familiar environment awakened memories she'd tried to suppress. The weight of command, the responsibility of making decisions that could save or cost hundreds of lives. "Ma'am," Cross said, setting down a secure phone after a 30-minute conversation with her superiors, "I've been in contact with Pentagon intelligence, and they've confirmed your identity through channels I don't have clearance to understand. Apparently, your existence has been a subject of debate in intelligence circles for years." Sam managed a rueful smile. "Let me guess. Half of them thought Ghost Squadron was disinformation, and the other half thought we were all dead." "Close. 2/3 thought it was elaborate psychological warfare, and 1/3 thought you were either dead or had been eliminated to protect state secrets." Cross leaned forward, her expression mixing professional respect with personal curiosity. "Ma'am, can I ask why you've been hiding? Your service record, what I'm cleared to know about it, indicates you were decorated for actions that prevented international conflicts. Why disappear into civilian life instead of accepting the recognition you earned?" The question touched the heart of everything Sam had been struggling with for 3 years. Recognition had never been the goal. Service had been the goal. But explaining that to someone who hadn't lived through the political aftermath of classified successes required more emotional energy than she had anticipated needing. "Because," she said carefully, "some victories create more problems than defeats. Ghost Squadron completed missions that were politically inconvenient to acknowledge. When success becomes a liability, the easiest solution is to make the successful people disappear." Cross nodded with the understanding of someone who'd navigated enough military bureaucracy to recognize political necessity disguised as operational security. "And now? Now the choice has been taken away from me. 3 years of hiding ended the moment I demonstrated capabilities that raised questions I couldn't answer without revealing everything else." A knock on the briefing room door interrupted their conversation. Cross opened it to find Colonel Michael Sterling, Fort Hamilton's commanding officer, accompanied by 2 individuals whose civilian clothes and security badges suggested intelligence personnel of some significant authority. "Ms. Blackwood," Sterling said, his voice carrying the formal respect reserved for distinguished visitors, "I'm Colonel Sterling. These gentlemen are from Defense Intelligence Agency and would like to speak with you about your current status and future availability." Sam studied the 3 men with the automatic threat assessment that had once been second nature. Government officials, certainly authorized to be here, probably representing agencies that operated at classification levels that made normal military intelligence look like public information. The conversation she had been dreading for 3 years was about to begin in earnest. "Before we continue," she said, "I want to make something clear. I'm not interested in resuming active duty. I'm not available for new missions or classified operations. I'm a civilian now, and I intend to remain one."
One of the DIA representatives, a man who introduced himself only as Agent Morrison, smiled with the patient expression of someone who'd conducted many similar conversations. Ma'am, we're not here to recruit you for new operations. We're here because your existence creates certain administrative complications that need to be resolved. What kind of complications? The kind that arise when someone with your clearance level and operational knowledge spends 3 years outside official oversight. The kind that require verification of security protocols and confirmation that classified information has been properly safeguarded. Sam felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with bureaucratic threats, disguised as procedural necessity. She'd been through enough debriefings to recognize when officials were testing her compliance versus her willingness to create problems for their administrative convenience.
Agent Morrison, she said, with the quiet authority that had once commanded elite soldiers in impossible situations. I've maintained operational security for 3 years while under no official oversight whatsoever. I've protected classified information while working in civilian environments that provided no security protocols. If you're questioning my discretion or reliability, perhaps you should examine why someone with my background felt it necessary to disappear in the first place. Colonel Sterling intervened before the conversation could escalate into the kind of confrontation that would require official documentation and formal resolution. Ms. Blackwood, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the purpose of this meeting. We're not here to question your loyalty or discretion. We're here because your presence has created an opportunity that we'd like to discuss. What kind of opportunity? The kind that involves sharing your expertise with personnel who could benefit from your experience, Sterling replied. Teaching, consulting, training, activities that would allow you to contribute to current military readiness while maintaining your civilian status. Sam looked around the room at faces that represented the military community she'd been exiled from 3 years ago. Officers who understood the value of her experience, officials who recognized the waste of keeping someone with her capabilities isolated from the service she'd dedicated her life to improving. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the possibility that her knowledge and experience might serve something larger than routine automotive repair, that the trials she'd endured, the training that had nearly broken her, the operations that cost so much to complete successfully, might still have value in preparing the next generation of warriors for challenges she'd already faced. But acceptance would mean giving up the invisibility that had protected her from the political complications that had ended her military career. It would mean trusting that the same system that had forced her into exile was ready to welcome her back as a valuable asset rather than a security liability. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. The answer would determine whether the Ghost Squadron Commander remained a hidden legend or became something more valuable, a teacher whose experience could multiply exponentially through every soldier she trained, every officer she advised, every mission she helped others complete successfully. Some legends were meant to stay buried. Others were too valuable to waste in comfortable obscurity. Colonel Sterling leaned forward in his chair, his expression carrying the weight of someone about to make an offer that had been discussed at levels far above his authority. Miss Blackwood, what I'm about to propose has been approved by Joint Chiefs and has support from multiple intelligence agencies. We'd like you to consider a position as Senior Tactical Consultant at the Advanced Warfare Training Institute. Sam had heard of AWTI, a classified facility where elite military personnel received instruction and techniques that pushed the boundaries of conventional warfare. It was where special operations units learned to handle situations that existing military doctrine couldn't adequately address, where the most challenging scenarios were analyzed and solutions developed for threats that hadn't yet materialized. Teaching, she asked, though the concept felt both foreign and strangely appealing after 3 years of exile. More than teaching, Agent Morrison interjected. Curriculum development, scenario planning, strategic consultation on operations that mirror missions you've already completed successfully. Your experience with impossible extractions, urban warfare and hostile populations, command decisions under extreme pressure, that knowledge is exactly what current special operations units need to develop. Major Cross watched the exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made in real time. The legendary Ghost Squadron Commander was being offered a chance to return to the community that had created her, not as an operator, but as the keeper of institutional knowledge that could prevent future teams from repeating mistakes that had already been learned through trial and sacrifice. The position would maintain your civilian status, but provide access to resources and authority commensurate with your experience. You'd work with teams being prepared for missions similar to ones Ghost Squadron handled, sharing tactical expertise that can't be learned from manuals or simulations. Sam considered the implications carefully. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that her military career was over, that her skills were no longer wanted or needed. The offer represented not just employment, but vindication, acknowledgement that the same expertise that had made her politically inconvenient was now considered invaluable for preparing the next generation of elite warriors. "What about security protocols?" she asked. "My existence was supposed to remain classified for reasons that haven't changed." The cover story would be that you're a retired special operations officer with extensive combat experience. Generic, but accurate, sufficient to justify your knowledge without revealing specifics about Ghost Squadron or missions that remain classified. And the soldiers I'd be training, they'd know they were learning from someone with actual combat experience, but not the extent or nature of that experience. Exactly. Your credibility would come from demonstrated competence rather than revealed credentials. Sam found herself thinking about the young soldiers she had encountered at the Veterans Day event. Bennett and Wong and dozens of others who carried themselves with the confidence of people who'd completed basic training but had never been tested by situations where the margin for error was measured in lives lost rather than points deducted. These soldiers, she said slowly, the ones who'd be receiving this training, they're being prepared for missions like the ones Ghost Squadron handled? Sterling nodded grimly. Global threats haven't decreased since your unit was disbanded. If anything, they've become more complex, more politically sensitive, more dependent on precisely the kind of expertise that Ghost Squadron developed through experience. Which means other teams are currently handling operations similar to ones you've already faced, but without the benefit of learning from someone who's actually succeeded at those impossible missions. The weight of that reality settled on Sam like familiar equipment, heavy, but necessary. Somewhere in the world, elite soldiers were facing challenges similar to ones she's already overcome, making decisions she's already made, learning lessons she's already learned through trials that had cost Ghost Squadron members their lives.
The Kazan extraction, she said quietly, that operation succeeded because we'd learned from 3 previous failures in similar situations. Teams that had been lost because they didn't know what we knew, hadn't developed the techniques we'd developed through mistakes that cost lives. And now, Morrison said, current teams are facing similar challenges without access to that institutional knowledge. Your experience, properly shared, could prevent repetition of those early failures. Sam stood and walked to the small window that provided the briefing room's only natural light. Outside, she could see young soldiers conducting training exercises with the enthusiasm of people who believed their current preparation was adequate for whatever challenges they might face. They had no way of knowing that their textbook solutions might be insufficient for real-world situations where enemies didn't follow standard tactics, and success required improvisation that couldn't be learned from manuals. "The position would be based here at Fort Hamilton?" she asked. "Initially, yes, but it would involve travel to other facilities, work with multiple units, consultation on operations being planned by various special operations commands. You'd essentially become the institutional memory that Ghost Squadron represented, sharing that knowledge across the entire spectrum of elite military units." The offer represented everything Sam had lost when she'd been forced into exile: purpose, community, the knowledge that her skills served something larger than personal survival.
but it also represented risks she'd learned to avoid through 3 years of careful invisibility. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "This isn't just a career decision, it's a decision about whether I'm ready to stop hiding from who I used to be." "Take all the time you need," Sterling replied, "but understand that the need for your expertise is urgent. Every day you spend deciding is another day that current operators face challenges without the benefit of your experience." As the meeting concluded and the officials departed, Sam found herself alone with Major Cross and Daniel, who'd been waiting patiently for news about her fate. The decision ahead of her felt enormous, not just about accepting employment, but about whether the Ghost Squadron Commander was ready to emerge from exile and resume service to the community that had created her. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who'd spent 3 years trying to convince her to reconnect with her military identity. "I'm thinking that maybe some knowledge is too valuable to keep hidden, and maybe some people are too skilled to waste their talents on comfortable anonymity." The offer lay before her like a bridge between the woman she'd been forced to become and the warrior she'd never really stopped being. The only question was whether she was brave enough to cross it.
3 days later, Sam stood in front of the same mirror in her apartment bathroom, but everything had changed. The woman looking back at her was no longer the invisible mechanic who'd spent 3 years hiding from her own capabilities. The Ghost Squadron Commander had returned, not to resume active operations, but to ensure that her hard-earned knowledge would serve the warriors who needed it most. She'd called Colonel Sterling that morning to accept the position. The decision hadn't come through careful deliberation, but through a moment of clarity while watching the news coverage of an international crisis that was being handled by special operations units who were learning the same lessons Ghost Squadron had learned years ago, but learning them through failure instead of instruction. "You sure about this?" Daniel asked, helping her load the last of her belongings into his pickup truck. She was keeping the apartment above Fletcher's garage as a weekend retreat, but her primary residence would now be the officer quarters at Fort Hamilton. "I'm sure," she replied, though the certainty felt fragile and new. "For 3 years, I convinced myself that staying hidden was the responsible choice. But watching those soldiers at the Veterans Day event, seeing them make the same assumptions we used to make before experience taught us better, I realized that hiding my knowledge wasn't protecting anyone. It was just wasting resources that could save lives." Hank Fletcher stood in the doorway of his garage, his weathered face carrying the mixed pride and loss that came with seeing exceptional employees move on to opportunities that matched their true capabilities. He'd known from the first day that Sam Blackwood was overqualified for fixing civilian vehicles, but he'd never imagined the extent of her background. "You take care of yourself," he said gruffly, extending a hand that she shook with genuine warmth. "And if this new job doesn't work out, you've always got a place here." "Thanks, Hank, for everything. For hiring me without questions, for letting me disappear when I needed to disappear." "For what it's worth, I think you're making the right choice. Some people are meant for bigger things than they're currently doing. You were always one of those people." The drive to Fort Hamilton felt different this time. Not like a reluctant visit to a world she'd been exiled from, but like a homecoming to a community that was ready to welcome back a member who'd been lost but not forgotten. The base looked the same as it had 3 days ago, but Sam's relationship to it had fundamentally changed. She was no longer an outsider observing military life. She was returning to the profession that had shaped her into someone capable of contributions that few people could make. Her new office was located in the Advanced Warfare Training Institute, a facility that existed within Fort Hamilton but operated according to security protocols that kept it separate from standard base operations. The building was unremarkable from the outside, deliberately designed to avoid drawing attention to the specialized training that occurred within its walls. Major Cross met her at the security checkpoint, her expression carrying professional enthusiasm mixed with personal curiosity about working with someone whose reputation had preceded them by years of whispered legend. "Welcome back," Cross said, using a phrase that acknowledged both Sam's return to military service and her emergence from 3 years of exile. "Your first assignment is with a group of 8 operators who are being prepared for a mission that bears significant resemblance to the Kazan extraction." Sam nodded,
feeling the familiar weight of responsibilities settle on her shoulders like equipment she'd never really learned to live without. These weren't students learning theoretical concepts. They were warriors preparing for situations where her knowledge could mean the difference between success and failure, between coming home alive and becoming casualties of avoidable mistakes. "What do they know about my background?" she asked. "That you're a retired special operation officer with extensive combat experience in situations similar to what they're training for. That your expertise has been specifically requested because standard training protocols aren't adequate for the challenges they'll face." Good. Credibility based on competence rather than credentials. Her first training session was scheduled for that afternoon. 8 elite soldiers who represented some of the most capable warriors in the American military, all of them volunteers for missions that carried casualty rates that made standard special operations look routine. As she entered the briefing room where they waited, Sam saw familiar expressions, the confident alertness of soldiers who believed their training had prepared them for whatever challenges they might face. It was the same expression she'd worn years ago, before experience taught her that confidence was valuable but insufficient for situations where the enemy didn't follow textbook strategies.
Gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded Ghost Squadron through impossible operations. Everything you think you know about hostage extraction is about to be challenged. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to prepare you for scenarios that your previous training never addressed. You're going to learn how to succeed when success requires you to abandon everything you've been taught and improvise solutions that don't exist in any manual. The lead operator, a master sergeant whose record indicated exceptional competence in standard special operations, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, we've all completed advanced extraction training. We're familiar with complex scenarios." Sam smiled, recognizing the same confidence she'd once carried into situations that had nearly destroyed her team before they'd learned to think beyond established procedures. "Master Sergeant, how many of your training scenarios involved hostages who didn't want to be rescued in compounds designed by people who understood how special operations teams think, defended by enemies who had studied American extraction techniques and developed specific countermeasures?" The silence that followed her question confirmed what she'd suspected. These soldiers were exceptionally well-trained for standard missions, but the situation they were preparing for would require expertise that could only come from someone who'd already faced similar impossible challenges and learned how to overcome them through experience rather than instruction. "This mission," she continued, "will succeed or fail based on your ability to adapt when your primary plans are compromised, when your backup strategies are anticipated, and when success requires you to make decisions that no training manual could adequately prepare you for. I'm here because I've been in exactly that situation, and I know how teams can survive when everything goes wrong." Over the following weeks, Sam discovered that teaching wasn't just about sharing knowledge. It was about watching exceptional soldiers become even more capable, seeing confidence evolve into competence that could handle situations that defied conventional solutions. Her students learned not just tactical techniques, but critical thinking skills that would serve them in any situation where standard approaches proved inadequate. The mission they were preparing for launched 6 weeks later. Sam monitored the operation from the Secure Communications Center, listening to encrypted reports that confirmed her training had achieved its purpose. The team encountered exactly the kind of complications she'd prepared them for: compromised extraction routes, unexpected resistance, hostages in different locations than intelligence had indicated. But they adapted, they improvised, they succeeded. "Control, this is Bravo Team. All packages secured, exfiltration complete, 0 friendly casualties." The words came through the speakers like vindication for every choice Sam had made over the past 3 years. Her knowledge, her experience, her hard-won expertise had multiplied through the soldiers she'd trained, extending the legacy of Ghost Squadron's impossible successes into missions that would never be publicly acknowledged. Later that evening, as she stood on the observation deck overlooking Fort Hamilton's parade ground, Sam reflected on the journey from invisible mechanic to senior tactical consultant.
The transition hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary, not just for her own sense of purpose, but for the warriors who needed access to knowledge that existed nowhere else. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Daniel. Saw the news about the successful operation overseas. Proud of you for finding a way to serve again. She replied, turns out some knowledge is too valuable to keep hidden. The faded tattoo on her wrist no longer felt like evidence of a lost identity. It had become documentation of experience that continued to serve something larger than herself. The Ghost Squadron Commander had found a new mission, ensuring that the next generation of impossible operations would succeed because someone who'd already faced those challenges was willing to teach others how to overcome them through experience rather than instruction. The Ghost had stepped back into the light, not as an operator, but as something more valuable, a teacher whose knowledge would live on in every soldier she trained, every mission they completed successfully, every life saved, because someone had been willing to share the lessons learned through trials that most people couldn't survive. In the end, that was enough. More than enough.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.